They had promised the people that fire would never fall from Japanese skies. For years, the generals and admirals of the Imperial High Command had stood before microphones and spoken into the souls of a nation, assuring them that the sacred homeland was untouchable. The war was far away, they said, on distant islands and foreign shores. The homeland was protected by ocean, by valor, by divine will itself. And the people believed them because they needed to believe, because the alternative was too terrible to imagine. But on a cold November morning in 1944, that promise burned to ash along with entire city blocks, and the men who had made those assurances found themselves reaching for words that no longer existed in their vocabulary. What happened in the meeting rooms of Tokyo in the weeks and months that followed was not what anyone might expect. There was no sudden clarity, no admission of miscalculation, no honest reckoning with the reality now visible in the smoke rising from Japanese cities. Instead, there was something far more human and far more tragic. There was denial wrapped in ceremony. There was blame dressed in the language of honor. There was a slow, agonizing refusal to speak the truth, even as that truth rained down from the bellies of silver aircraft flying so high they seemed to belong to another world entirely. The Japanese High Command said many things when America began bombing from Saipan, but the most revealing was what they could not bring themselves to say at all. The story begins not with the first bomb, but with the fall of an island most Japanese citizens had never heard of. Saipan was a speck in the vast Pacific, a place of sugarcane fields and steep cliffs, home to a small population of Japanese settlers and indigenous Chamorro people. To the average citizen in Tokyo or Osaka, it meant nothing, but to the men in the Imperial General Headquarters, it meant everything. Saipan sat approximately 1,500 miles from the Japanese home islands. Within range, that phrase echoed through war rooms and planning offices like the tolling of a funeral bell. Within range of the new American bomber, the B-29 Superfortress, an aircraft so large and so advanced that Japanese military planners had initially dismissed it as impossible. The battle for Saipan lasted from June to July of 1944. Japanese forces fought with their characteristic ferocity, but the outcome was never truly in doubt. American naval and air superiority was overwhelming. When the island fell, more than 30,000 Japanese soldiers lay dead, many by their own hand rather than face capture. Thousands of civilians also perished, some leaping from the cliffs at the island's northern tip in a mass suicide that shocked even hardened American military observers. The images of bodies floating in the water, of families holding hands as they jumped, became symbols of a war that had moved beyond the bounds of ordinary human understanding. But in Tokyo, the immediate concern was not the dead, it was what would come next. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo understood immediately what the loss meant. He had staked his political survival on the promise that the absolute defense perimeter would hold, that the Americans would be stopped far from the homeland. He had personally assured the emperor that Japan's position was secure. Now that assurance lay shattered among the rubble of Saipan's fallen fortifications. Within days of the island's fall, Tojo was forced to resign. He did so with the formal dignity expected of a Japanese leader, but those who knew him said his eyes carried the weight of a man who had seen his own death approaching. He would not face that death for another year, and it would come not from shame but from an American hangman's noose. But in that moment of resignation, something had already ended for him. The certainty that had defined his leadership was gone. The new government spoke in careful circles. They acknowledged setbacks. They referenced strategic adjustments. They never, not once, admitted that the home islands were now vulnerable in a way they had never been before. This silence was not cowardice, though it might appear so to outside observers. It was something more complex, rooted in a system of governance where direct statements of failure were culturally impossible. The Japanese language itself, with its layers of indirection and honorific complexity, seemed designed to avoid such stark admissions. High Command could discuss the need for greater civilian resilience without acknowledging why that resilience would soon be tested. They could speak of production demands without naming the bombers that would soon make production itself a desperate race against destruction. In the offices of the Army and Navy General Staffs, the discussions were more frank, but only slightly. Military planners began drawing up projections for air defense that they knew were inadequate. They calculated how many fighters could be spared from other theaters, how many anti-aircraft batteries could be positioned around major cities, how many civilian volunteers could be trained to fight fires with bucket brigades and sand. The numbers never added up. The B-29 flew higher than any Japanese interceptor could comfortably reach. Its defenses were formidable, and there would be hundreds of them, then thousands. Their factories in America turning them out at a pace Japan could not match. The planning officers knew this. They wrote their reports anyway, because that was their duty. What else could they do but their duty? The first raid came on the 24th of November 1944. 111 B-29 seconds lifted off from the newly constructed airfields on Saipan and Tinian, their massive engines straining under the weight of high explosives. Their target was the Nakajima Aircraft Factory in Tokyo, a facility producing the engines that powered Japan's own warplanes. It was a precision strike, aimed at industrial capability rather than civilian populations. The distinction would blur almost immediately in the months to come. But that morning, American planners still believed they could win through targeted destruction of military infrastructure. The bombers flew in formation, their silver bodies catching the pale winter sunlight, and the people of Tokyo looked up and saw their future arriving. The reaction on the ground was chaos wrapped in stunned disbelief. Air raid sirens wailed through the city, a sound most residents had never heard outside of occasional drills. People rushed to shelters that were poorly constructed and badly marked. Many simply stood in the streets, staring upward, unable to process what they were seeing. The bombs fell, and buildings that had stood for generations became wreckage in an instant. The fires started, the smoke rose, and somewhere in the Imperial Palace compound, the Emperor received word that the capital itself had been struck. His reaction was not recorded in detail, but those who saw him in the following days spoke of a man who had aged visibly, as if the bombs had extracted years from his face, along with their physical damage. High Command's official response was a masterpiece of careful language. The raid was described as a nuisance, an act of desperation by an enemy whose supply lines were overextended. Casualty figures were minimized. Damage assessments were vague. The people were assured that countermeasures were being implemented, that the raiders would pay dearly for their audacity. None of this was technically false, but none of it was truly honest either. It was not the lies that revealed the High Command's state of mind, but the gaps between their words. What they did not say spoke louder than any official statement. In private meetings, the tone was different. Generals who had spent their careers projecting confidence now sat in silence, waiting for someone else to speak first. The question that hung in the air was not how to stop the bombers, because everyone knew that stopping them was likely impossible. The question was how to maintain the national will to fight when every raid made the impossibility of victory more obvious. This was not a question anyone wanted to answer aloud. To answer it would be to acknowledge the premise behind it. And acknowledging that premise was simply not something the Japanese command structure permitted. There was a particular kind of shame in those rooms, a shame that had no easy outlet. These were men who had built their identities on the concept of Bushido, the warrior's code that prized death before dishonor. They had sent hundreds of thousands of young men to die with that principle as their guiding light. Now they sat in comfortable offices while enemy aircraft flew overhead, and they could not even speak honestly about what was happening. The shame was not just about military failure. It was about the gap between the mythology they had created and the reality they now inhabited. They had told the people that the war was sacred, that Japan was protected by the gods, that the Yamato spirit would overcome any material disadvantage. The B-29 seconds did not seem to care about the Yamato spirit. As winter turned to spring in 1945, the raids intensified. American strategists, frustrated by the limitations of high-altitude precision bombing, shifted to a new approach. General Curtis LeMay, the new commander of the bombing campaign, ordered his B-29 seconds to fly lower at night, loaded not with high explosives but with incendiary bombs. The wooden cities of Japan became kindling. On March 9th and 10th, more than 300 bombers dropped nearly 2,000 tons of incendiaries on Tokyo. The resulting firestorm killed approximately 100,000 people in a single night, making it one of the deadliest attacks in human history, more immediately lethal even than the atomic bombs that would come months later. The Sumida River boiled. Mothers running with children in their arms simply burst into flame. The heat was so intense that buildings blocks away from the impact zones ignited spontaneously. And still, High Command could not speak plainly. The statements continued. The raid was acknowledged. The damage was significant, they admitted, but the spirit of the people remained unbroken. There were calls for greater sacrifice, for increased production, for volunteer fire brigades and neighborhood defense associations. The language was the language of resistance, of defiance, of eventual victory. But beneath the words, something was crumbling. Officers who delivered these statements in public sometimes returned to their offices and sat in silence for hours, unable to reconcile what they had said with what they knew. Some drank heavily. Some wrote poetry, trying to find meaning in classical forms where they could not find it in military planning. Some simply stopped speaking altogether outside of official duties, withdrawing into a private world where the contradictions did not have to be acknowledged. There were moments of strange humanity in the midst of this institutional denial. A general known for his fierce advocacy of continued resistance was found one morning feeding birds in the garden outside his office, carefully placing seeds on a stone as if the task required his full attention. When asked what he was doing, he said only that he had read that certain migrating species would soon be passing through, and he wanted them to find food when they arrived. The bombs did not care about bird migration either, but in that small act of tenderness, something true was expressed that could not be expressed in any meeting. The war was lost. Everyone knew it. No one could say it. So they fed birds and wrote poetry and drank sake and waited for an ending that seemed both inevitable and impossible. The civilians of Japan developed their own relationship with the raids, a rhythm of fear and exhaustion that became almost normalized. Parents learned which shelters were safest. Children learned to distinguish the sound of different aircraft engines. Mothers became skilled at packing emergency bags, at knowing exactly how many precious seconds they had between the first siren and the need to run. There was a particular smell that those who survived the raids would remember for the rest of their lives. It was the smell of burning wood mixed with something else, something that could not be named directly but that everyone understood. It was the smell of their neighbors, their cities, their certainties turning to smoke and drifting away on winds that carried ash for miles. Some in high command wanted to sue for peace. These voices grew louder as the months passed, but they remained a minority. The doctrine of Ketsugo, the decisive homeland battle, still dominated strategic thinking. The plan was to make an American invasion so costly in blood that Washington would negotiate rather than continue. Millions of Japanese were being trained in basic combat, armed with bamboo spears, and told they would face the enemy on the beaches. The women and elderly and children would fight alongside the soldiers. Victory was still the official goal, even as everyone quietly understood that victory in any meaningful sense was no longer possible. The word itself had changed meaning. Victory now meant only making the defeat painful enough that some negotiating position might be preserved. It was not the fire that broke them, but the sky itself becoming an enemy. It was not the casualties that shattered their worldview, but the helplessness. For generations, Japanese military doctrine had emphasized the offensive, the aggressive action, the warrior spirit that could overcome material disadvantage through sheer will. The bombers mocked this doctrine every time they appeared. There was no glorious charge to be made against aircraft flying at 30,000 feet. There was no sword that could reach them. There was only the waiting, the sirens, the running, the fire, and then the silence of the aftermath. High Command could not integrate this passivity into their understanding of warfare. They had no language for being victims. They had only the language of heroes, and heroes were supposed to act, not simply endure. The Emperor's role in all of this remained deliberately ambiguous, as his role in everything did. Hirohito was briefed on the raids, shown damage assessments, informed of casualty figures. His reactions were noted but not recorded in detail. Later, after the war, he would claim that he had always wanted peace, that he had been constrained by the military leaders around him. This was partially true and partially convenient memory. What is certain is that he said nothing publicly to contradict the High Command's optimistic statements. His silence gave consent to the continued pretense. Whether that silence came from conviction, from protocol, or from simple inability to imagine an alternative, historians still debate. The Emperor was a god, after all, at least officially. And gods do not admit that their divine nation is being systematically reduced to rubble. By summer of 1945, there were no good options left, only varieties of defeat. The atomic bombs that fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August were in some ways simply the culmination of what had begun with that first raid from Saipan 9 months earlier. The technology was different, more concentrated in its horror, but the basic equation was the same. America could destroy Japan, and Japan could not stop it. The High Command that had promised protection had been proven utterly wrong. The gods had not intervened. The Yamato spirit had not been sufficient. The sacred homeland had burned, was burning, would burn again if the war continued. When the surrender was finally announced, some in High Command chose death. Several generals and admirals committed ritual suicide rather than live in a defeated Japan. Others prepared to go into captivity, uncertain what awaited them. A few plotted coups that came to nothing. Most simply went home to families they had not seen in months or years, trying to find words to explain what had happened. There were no adequate words. There never would be. What Japanese High Command said when America began bombing from Saipan was ultimately less important than what they could not say. They could not say that they had failed. They could not say that the promises were false. They could not say that the deaths of all those soldiers on all those islands had been in vain, or that the sacrifices they were asking of civilians would not change the outcome. They could not say that the war was lost while any possibility remained of saying something else. This was not unique to Japan. It is the nature of institutions in crisis to cling to language that has lost its connection to reality, to keep speaking in formulas even as those formulas become absurd. The tragedy was not that Japan's leaders were monsters. Some were. Many were simply men trapped in a system that left no room for truth. The B-29 seconds kept coming until there was almost nothing left to bomb. And still the meetings continued. The reports were filed, the statements were issued. The language of invincibility persisted even as invincibility revealed itself to be nothing but language all along. There is something in this that speaks to more than one war, more than one nation. It speaks to the human capacity for maintaining belief in the face of overwhelming evidence, the desperate need to continue speaking as if words alone could change facts. High Command kept speaking because silence would have been an admission they could not make, and so the fires burned, and the words continued, and the gap between them grew wide enough to swallow an empire. Somewhere in the ruins of post-war Japan, an elderly man who had served in the planning offices sat with his grandchildren and tried to explain what had happened. He spoke carefully, choosing his words with the precision of someone who had learned that words could do great harm. He did not claim heroism. He did not deny shame. He simply said that there had been a time when everyone believed certain things, and then those things had been proven wrong, and then there had been nothing to believe at all. The children nodded, not fully understanding. They would grow up in a different Japan, one that had made its peace with defeat and found a new kind of strength in the rebuilding. But the old man would remember the sirens all his life, and the silence in the meeting rooms, and the terrible weight of things that could not be spoken. The story of those months has echoes that reach far beyond 1945. Every institution that has ever faced catastrophic failure knows something of what Japan's High Command experienced. The language fails. The certainties dissolve. The people who built their identities on promises they could not keep find themselves reaching for words that no longer exist. What do you say when the sky itself becomes an enemy? What do you say when everything you believe turns to smoke? These are not questions with easy answers. They are the questions that war leaves behind, long after the bombs stop falling and the silence finally comes. And there are thousands more stories like this one, waiting to be remembered.